Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's national call for our HoUSed campaign. I'm going to give it maybe about 30 seconds to a minute to allow for more people to join before we start in on the agenda. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call. I'm going to give it just a little bit more time to give a chance for others to join before we start with our speakers. Thank you. Okay, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable homes. I'm Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Income Housing Coalition, and I'm glad to welcome you here for a full agenda. As you all know painfully well, negotiations on Build Back Better have been dormant, if not dead, for some time, but they do seem to be restarting somewhat again. It's very hard to know at this point whether it'll go anywhere, but there have been a few promising developments, including some discussions between Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senator Joe Manchin, some comments that Senator Manchin made at a conference today. So, of course, we are staying laser focused on the possibility, and we will alert all of you and our entire network if and when things become more concrete. But in the meantime, I just want to encourage you all to continue doing as you've been doing so effectively in letting your members of Congress know that housing investments must be included in any reconciliation package. And you'll hear more details on this, on appropriations, on other housing bills soon from Kim Johnson. But I also wanted to first note the big news from last week when the Biden administration released its housing supply action plan to help close the housing supply gap in 5 years. So there too, the need for housing investments from Build Back Better are really strongly reiterated, as well as a number of other administrative actions that the Biden administration plans to take in the coming months. And so I'm really pleased that we'll have Erica Pothig from the Domestic Policy Council, Special Assistant to President Biden, who will be joining today's call to share some more information. And then finally, I just wanted to briefly mention two events that are happening with the White House tomorrow, which were just confirmed this morning. The first is by invitation only. So NLIHC will be participating, and I wanted to make sure you were all aware that the White House is holding a listening session on actions that the administration can take to enhance renter protections. So we're really pleased to see them inviting these conversations on this really important topic. And NLIHC, of course, will make a strong case for robust tenant protections through both administrative and congressional actions. The second event is a public event, which I'll be speaking at, and you are all invited to attend. So the White House will be holding an event tomorrow when they'll also be publishing a new report on advancing equity through the American Rescue Plan. So it's a 1-hour event from 2:30 to 3:30 Eastern Time. And we'll hear from Gene Sperling, from DPC Director Susan Rice. There'll be several cabinet secretaries giving remarks. And then I'll be honored really to speak on a small panel of NGOs that have worked with the administration to advance equity in American Rescue Plan programs. And of course, I'll be focusing on emergency rental assistance. So again, that event is tomorrow from 2:30 to 3:30, and I see that Elena has already dropped the link for that event in the chat box. You can register and participate tomorrow. So now I will go ahead and move us into our agenda, and I'll invite Kim Johnson from NLIHC up first to give updates on the reconciliation bill, on FY23 appropriations, and on the Eviction Crisis Act, as well as any other relevant updates. So Kim, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane, and hello, everyone. My name is Kim Johnson. I'm a senior policy analyst here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'm filling in for Sarah today to bring the latest updates from Capitol Hill. So let's start out with appropriations. Appropriations leaders in the House and the Senate are hoping to avoid a significant delay in the fiscal year 2023 budget, but there is reportedly still a long way to go before they are able to reach an agreement on top-line spending numbers. Senate Appropriations Chair Patrick Leahy and Ranking Member Richard Shelby met last week to continue top-line talks, but urgent supplemental funding measures, including aid to Ukraine and a bill to address the infant formula shortage, have really slowed down those FY23 negotiations. Still, appropriators remain optimistic that they are going to be able to avoid that significant delay in enacting the FY23 omnibus spending package. Just to recap, the FY23 budget was significantly delayed because of a partisan disagreement over how much to increase funding for defense and non-defense spending, with Democrats maintaining that a significant increase in non-defense spending was necessary to make up for years of austerity under the Budget Control Act, and Republicans insisting on parity between non-defense and defense programs. But even without an agreement on top-line funding numbers, appropriators in the House are still likely to move forward with drafting an FY23 spending bill and just using the president's FY23 budget request as a benchmark for spending. House Appropriations Chair Rosa DeLauro and Ranking Member Kay Granger set a tentative schedule for appropriations subcommittees to review and vote on their respective bills between June 13th and June 22nd, and then a full committee review and vote during the week of June 22nd to June 30th. So NLIHC and our partners with the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding are leading our annual 302B letter to demand that Congress provide the highest possible funding for affordable housing, homelessness, and community development resources in fiscal year 2023. And that letter is open to everyone, national, state, local, tribal, territorial organizations. So if you haven't done so already, please, you are welcome to join on. We have almost 1,700 organizations signed on. So thank you to those of you who have already joined. Advocates should also contact their members of Congress and urge them to support significant funding for NLIHC's top priorities in this spending bill. And that includes $32.13 billion for tenant-based rental assistance, which is enough to renew all existing contracts and to expand housing vouchers to an additional 200,000 households. $5.125 billion for the Public Housing Capital Fund to preserve public housing, and $5.06 billion for the Public Housing Operating Fund. We're also asking for $3.6 billion for HUD's Homeless Assistance Grants Program to help address the needs of people experiencing homelessness, $100 million for legal aid to prevent evictions, and $300 million for the Competitive Tribal Housing Program targeted to tribes with the greatest needs. So that yearly appropriations process is vital to ensuring continued and expanded funding for HUD's affordable housing programs, but budget reconciliation, which allows the Senate to pass legislation with a simple majority of 51 votes rather than the 60 votes usually required in the chamber, represents the best opportunity to enact the bold, large-scale investments in affordable housing that are really truly needed to address the severe lack of deeply affordable and accessible rental homes. Like Diane said at the offset, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senator Joe Manchin met last week to discuss the outline of a potential reconciliation package, which is the clear signal in weeks that congressional Democrats have not yet given up on enacting a reconciliation bill before the November midterms. Senator Manchin, which, as we all know, was the lone Democratic holdout on the Build Back Better Act, maintains that any future reconciliation package should focus on increasing federal revenues by changing the tax code and using those new revenues to fight inflation, address climate change, draw down the federal deficit, and reduce the cost of prescription drugs. The cost of housing, of course, is the single largest component of the consumer price index, which is a common measure of inflation. So addressing the rising cost of housing is going to be central to decreasing inflationary pressure on households. And that is especially true for long-term costs. So we are still pushing Congress to include in any reconciliation package the significant funding for targeted affordable housing investments that were included in the Build Back Better Act. And that includes our top priorities. So that's $25 billion to expand housing vouchers to more than 300,000 households, $65 billion to preserve public housing for its 2 million residents, $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund to build, preserve, and operate more than 150,000 units of affordable, accessible homes for people with the lowest incomes. And before turning it back over to Diane, I wanted to flag one more update. NLIHC launched recently a sign-on letter urging Congress to enact the Bipartisan Eviction Crisis Act, which was introduced in the Senate by Senators Michael Bennet and Rob Portman. That's a Democrat and Republican from Colorado and Ohio, respectively. And its House companion bill, the Stable Families Act, which will soon be introduced by Representative Richie Torres of New York. So those bills would create a permanent emergency rental assistance program known as the Emergency Assistance Fund to provide financial assistance and stability services to low-income households who are facing a sudden economic shock that threatens their housing stability. We know that 71% of households with the lowest incomes spend more than half of their income on rent and utilities alone every month, and that leaves very little margin for unexpected expenses. So as a result, something like a broken down car, unreimbursed medical bills, or a sudden drop in income can send households down a spiral of housing insecurity, eviction, and in worst cases, homelessness. So that emergency assistance fund would help stabilize households experiencing a sudden economic shock before they result in eviction, instability, or homelessness, which often require more extensive and expensive housing assistance, not to mention, of course, the trauma of facing eviction or homelessness. The fund would be run as a grant program administered by HoUSed and funded at $3 billion per year. Eligible grantees would include state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, which would be able to partner with local nonprofits, organizations to distribute that funding. Additionally, funds would be deeply targeted to serve households with the lowest incomes who are most at risk of eviction following an unexpected financial shock. If you haven't done so already, please do join the Eviction Crisis Act that I see my colleague Elena just dropped in the chat to show your organization's support for that bill. And that is it for me. I will be happy to answer any questions. And in the meantime, I'll turn it back over to Diane.
Great, thanks so much, Kim. That was a really helpful overview. There were several questions that came in. It looks like Elena has been answering them via the chat box. I did see one, if you could just repeat, Kim, when the appropriations hearings are expected. When are the dates that we're expecting the appropriations markups?
Yeah, of course. So that is going to be, let me double check my notes real fast because I want to make sure that I get it right. So that is going to be a subcommittee markup the week of June 13th to the 22nd, and then full committee markup June 22nd to the 30th.
Okay, great. So just to amplify a couple of things that Kim said, so there's 2 outstanding sign-on letters that we want to encourage everybody to sign. One, the letter for the 302B, or the highest possible allocation for HUD spending. Elena put that link in the chat box. And the other for getting the Eviction Crisis Act enacted. So we want to strongly encourage everybody to please sign both letters, and both links are in the chat box. Thanks very much, Kim. And thanks, Elena, for putting the info in the chat box. So next on the agenda, I'm really pleased to welcome back to the call Rashida Phillips, who has been on previously when she was with the Community Legal Services of Philadelphia doing amazing work on emergency rental assistance and eviction prevention there. Now she's the Director of Housing at PolicyLink, and I'm really pleased to welcome her back to talk about an important new report that they put out and she co-authored on severe racial inequity and the affordable housing shortage in major cities. Rashida, thanks for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. So I have some slides that I would love to show. Thank you so much. So yes, I'm going to share about a report that Policy Link just put out through our National Equity Atlas, which is a collaboration between Policy Link and USC Equity Research Institute. The report was authored by Ty Lay, Edward Nuña, Sarah Truhaff, and I helped out as well. And so we'll go to the next slide, please. So essentially what the Shrinking Geographies report shows is that across the 100 largest metro areas, the number of neighborhoods with affordable rental housing for low, median, and moderate income households has declined. So particularly between 2013 and 2019, there was a significant decline in the number of areas that people at those income levels could afford to live in. And so we look at this this phenomena using questions and data from median market rents by zip code from Zillow, and then also looking at metro level census data on household income overall and for Black and Latinx and white households for the years 2013 and 2019 in order to capture that period of economic recovery between the Great Recession and the pandemic, as well as neighborhood opportunity, which we look at using the Child Opportunity Index from Brandeis University. We're also really focusing on income and race for this particular study. So again, looking at 80% of area median income for Black, Latinx, and white households at the median income for their racial ethnic group in the region. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So our guiding research questions for this report, again, we're asking three main questions. First, we're asking, how does neighborhood affordability for low-income households differ across metros? Second, we're asking, how does neighborhood affordability vary for Black, Latinx, and white households across metros? And then third, is the geography of opportunity for low-income households and households of color shrinking over time? And is it working to restrict housing choices to an even smaller number of neighborhoods that are far away from the locus of economic activity? And what we find just in general, but I'll go a little bit over the findings, is that not only is there an overall shortage of affordable rental homes, right, but they are rarely located in what's considered high opportunity neighborhoods. So these are going to be neighborhoods that have high quality schools, safe streets, clean air, parks, reliable transit, and proximity to jobs, retail, and services. Instead, most of these places are concentrated in disinvested neighborhoods that are going to lack the opportunity structures that are often, coming with harm from polluted air to decrepit infrastructure to excessive surveillance and police violence and lack of housing stability. Next slide, please. So we came up with a number of key findings in the study. One, working class households, again, face a shrinking geography of opportunity in metro America. So I already highlighted across the 100 most populous metropolitan areas, the number of zip codes where the median market rents are affordable to low income households has declined by almost 50% in some areas. And then next, key finding is that Black and Latinx households have the fewest choices when it comes to affordable neighborhoods. So in 2019, only 7% of zip codes in the top 100 metro areas had median market rents that were affordable to Black households at the median income for all Black households in that metro. Black households experienced the steepest declines in affordable neighborhoods in the years preceding the pandemic. We all know that, again, a lot of the issues and problems made worse during the pandemic started long before that. And so looking specifically at that area, at that period of time between 2013 and 2019, that even as the economy was recovering from that last recession and median incomes increased for households of all races and ethnicities, the number of zip codes with median market rents affordable to median low income Black households decreased by 14%. And then last key finding is that the majority of neighborhoods affordable for Black, Latinx, and low income renters are low opportunity neighborhoods again. Next slide, please. So again, this just shows you visually, right, everything that I just shared about the key findings. Again, in this chart, this shows a shrinking number of metro zip codes that are affordable for low and moderate income households. And the steepest decline was for low income households who saw a 50% drop in zip codes with affordable median market rents. So we went from about 1,400 zip codes, 1,479 to about 736 zip codes that were affordable for folks at low incomes. And then you can see for median income, moderate income, also experienced a pretty heavy drop in terms of affordability. Next slide, please. And then this shows you a spread across the United States, again, that between 2013 and 2019, the number of affordable zip codes declined in 81 of the 100 largest metro areas. And so just in case you can't see the colors a little bit closer up, the yellow is decline and purple is where it stayed static, and then green is where it's increased. And so in most places, the number of affordable areas has declined. Next slide, please. And this graph, again, just gives you a closer look. The majority of neighborhoods affordable to low-income households are low or very low opportunity, as I talked about earlier. Next slide, please. So now I just want to zoom in. We have some maps, and I'll drop the links in the chat to the maps and to the interactive maps that you can take a look at for your metro area. Just wanted to share an example of Philadelphia, right, where in 2013, there were 33 zip codes available to households at 80% AMI. And then by 2019, that has dropped to 17 zip codes available to those families. And then what remains, right, is housing that is concentrated in very low opportunity areas, and only a small section that's going to be concentrated in what's considered moderate opportunity areas. But for the most part, there's been both a decline and a concentration in areas that are considered low income. Next slide, please. And again, you know, this has a particular impact. It has a particular impact on specific communities. And so in 2019, Black and Latinx households could only afford 7% and 16% of zip codes respectively. And so these communities are seeing the largest impacts in terms of areas that are affordable for them and being pushed out of those neighborhoods and pushed to the edges of the city or of the area where they live in, which again tends to be lower opportunity areas. Next slide, please. And then for median income, Black, Latinx, and white households, affordability decreased in more metros than it increased, right? So this is not just impacting those with the lowest incomes, it's also impacting people at the median income level as well. And so for across the board, right, again, there's a particular impact on Black and Latinx communities, but it's also impacting white households as well. White households in many places are also seeing decreased affordability in areas that are at, you know, affordable for their incomes. Next slide, please. And again, more than 80% of neighborhoods affordable for the median Black household are low or very low opportunity. Again, it's just worth emphasizing, right, that not only are there shrinking areas of places that are affordable for these households and communities, they are also being concentrated in areas that are low opportunity where, you know, the cycle just continues in terms of being housing unstable, being cut off from access to jobs, to education, to healthy grocery stores, things like that. Next slide, please. And then this just gives you, again, a zoom back into Philadelphia as the metro area. And I'm focused on Philly because that's where I'm from. But for here, right, I showed you earlier for all households at 80% of AMI. But this is looking specifically at Black households, right? And shows that in 2013, there were 11 areas that were affordable to those. And I'm sorry, these maps should be switched. But in 2013, 11 areas that were affordable. And then in 2019, 0 areas that were affordable to people at 41,000 AMI. And then on the right-hand side, you see for white households, right, this looks very differently. In 2013, 216 areas were affordable, zip codes were affordable, and then in 2019, 237. So here, these households saw an increase in available zip codes while Black households saw a decrease. Next slide. So the implications just are that, right, there's a growing gap in access to affordable housing in high quality neighborhoods, which is only reinforcing longstanding patterns of racial segregation and creating new ones. And that while this analysis is pre-pandemic, all signs indicate, right, for all the reasons that we know, that these trends are only worsening, with 6 million households behind on rent, and then 2021 seeing rents increase by at least 10% in 149 metro regions. And so altogether, this underscores the need for new and refreshed approaches to housing justice that will address the roots of systemic racial inequities as they continue to deepen. And so next slide, I'll just share briefly our policy recommendations. We have recommendations in 4 areas. The first is to keep renters in their home by making eviction protections and rental assistance programs permanent and stabilizing rents. So this is going to include expanding and making permanent COVID-19 housing solutions, eviction diversion, right to counsel, rental assistance, leveraging federal recovery resources to support eviction prevention, enacting rent regulations and just cause eviction protections, et cetera, supporting tenant serving organizations as well. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. No, keep it back. Sorry. Next recommendation is going to be to preserve and expand affordability in all neighborhoods, including high opportunity and gentrifying areas. And so, right, we also don't want to just focus on putting resources, more resources into what are considered already high opportunity areas, but also to make sure that resources are built into communities that have been long disinvested in or long considered low opportunity areas. And so this includes preserving and existing affordable housing units and constructing new affordable housing, increasing the supply and availability of housing vouchers and other tenant-based subsidies, along with protections that ensure that people don't face discrimination when trying to utilize those resources. Third will be open up access to high opportunity neighborhoods while investing in the neighborhoods where working class renters of color already live, as I just highlighted. So that includes prioritizing land use reforms, increasing affordable housing options in those neighborhoods, fostering meaningful engagement with impacted communities. And then the last recommendation is to improve neighborhood quality where housing is affordable and invest in the idea of spatial reparations. And so that means creating new approaches to housing development and infrastructure building and redressing discriminatory housing policies at the local level. So last slide just has my information, and I'll make sure that we share the links to the report in the chat. And thank you all so much for having me.
Thanks, Rashida. That was a really helpful overview of a very important report. So thanks for that. There's in the chat box, Aaron Shaw has a long comment on congenital heart disease and the impacts that can flow from that, including related to homelessness. So I encourage people to take a look at that. There's a comment too from Nick Worrell, Rashida, that I think you might want to respond to, where he says that low-income housing in California is a joke, that it's only affordable for the rich or for middle class and not for the very lowest income people who need it the most. So just wanted to give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. And I think that phenomenon, right, is happening across the country. I mean, California is one example, especially as large as it is, right, and the many different communities that are experiencing in different ways housing insecurity. But you're absolutely right. But that also offers a lot of opportunity. I think in California, particularly, there's very strong tenant organizing happening. There has been a lot of wins and victories and folks looking at these issues. And so, we have to continue to build and organize and come together around this and start to really understand the root causes of some of these issues, and that it's going to take some local solutions and not just siloed, policies, one-offs, right? But things that work together to actually address at scale some of the really deep and longstanding issues that we're seeing. So thank you for that comment, Nick, and we'll be happy to talk further about that if folks want to reach out.
Thanks, Rashida. And there's several other people that are echoing similar sentiments from Shirley and Carlos, all noting that housing that is being built isn't being built affordable to the income levels that need it the most. So appreciate your sharing the recommendations. There's a couple of people who asked if we can post them. I believe Elena has already posted them in the chat, the link to the report, which includes the recommendations. So encourage people to look at that. We can drop the link again. And then of course we will share it. Oh, and it's on the slide right now. And we will share the links to in the follow-up information that we share out to everybody who participated today. So Rashida, thanks again so much for joining. Thanks for your good work. All right, I'm going to turn now to our next agenda item, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our next guest, who is Erica Pothig. She is Special Assistant to the President for Housing and Urban Policy. And Erica is a longtime expert on and friend to affordable housing. She's been on this national call before, so it's a pleasure to welcome her back. Before she joined the Biden-Harris administration on the Domestic Policy Council, she was Chief Innovation Officer and Vice President at the Urban Institute. She served in the Obama administration in a number of roles, including Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy Development and Research at HUD. She was a leading architect of the White House Council for Strong Cities and Strong Communities, and she led housing portfolios at the MacArthur Foundation and the City of Chicago's Department of Housing. So she joins us today to share some more details about the administration's housing supply action plan, which I mentioned at the top of the call. So Erica, thanks very much for joining today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Diane, and thank you for the invitation to come back. I love coming to this weekly call because you bring together so many important soldiers in this work that we do together to advance more equitable, inclusive housing policy at the federal, state, and local level. So thank you. So a week ago, we released the Housing Supply Action Plan, and the prior week, President Biden made a speech where he said tackling inflation is his top economic priority. His economic policy agenda is geared toward helping families and the economy manage through this period of elevated global inflation by reducing the costs that families face. At the same time, it's critical that we take actions on the supply side of the economy to improve our economic capacity and ease price pressures over time. So last Monday, the administration announced an action plan to ease the burden of housing costs, taking a series of executive actions to address one of the largest items in a typical family's budget and one of the largest drivers of inflation in our economy. And the action plan also includes the legislative solutions to boost housing supply that the administration has already proposed and worked alongside of Diane and others at the coalition and you all in the field to advocate for, some of which have received bipartisan support. But the plan also includes the work of an interagency group that identified executive actions, administrative actions that federal agencies are already taking or will take in the year ahead. And these combined actions, which are rolled up in the action plan, along with the current momentum in the market, state and local reforms, will help to close the housing supply shortfall in 5 years. Now, when aligned with other policies to reduce housing costs and ensure affordability, such as rental assistance and first-generation down payment assistance, closing the gap will mean more affordable rents and more attainable homeownership for Americans in every community. The housing, as you all know, the housing supply shortfall is deep and long-standing, largely resulting from underbuilding in the decade after the Great Recession. This textbook mismatch between supply and demand has meant skyrocketing rents and homeownership becoming increasingly out of reach. But the action plan we released last week highlights that there are solutions to this challenge, and the administration is committed to using every tool available to easing the burden of housing costs by building more new housing and preserving the existing housing stock. The legislative solutions the administration has proposed are detailed in the action plan as well, but the administration calls on Congress to pass these investments that were part of the House-passed reconciliation bill, including bipartisan proposals like the expansion of the low-income housing tax credit and the new Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, regardless of the legislative vehicle. Now, I want to walk through some of the new administrative actions that the administration announced last week, which fall into 5 categories. The first category is zoning and land use reform. So in order to eliminate needless barriers to housing production, the action plan includes new steps to leverage existing federal funding to encourage state and local reform. Now, this is not necessarily a new idea. This is an idea that many others have promoted and described ahead of us. But I think the current moment, alongside the resources through the infrastructure bill, allowed the administration to advance a set of policies that will reward jurisdictions that have reformed zoning and land use policies with higher scores in federal grant processes. Now, we've done this already for $6 billion of grant opportunities, and we'll continue to do it going forward. And this includes flexible infrastructure funding that is part of that bipartisan infrastructure law, in addition to the Economic Development Administration at Commerce's grant processes. So these actions build on the solutions that the administration has proposed, including the Unlocking Possibilities program, which is a piece of that House passed reconciliation package. So the second theme is piloting new financing. Well, the federal government currently offers a range of different financing options for large multifamily development. Market gaps exist for the construction and rehabilitation of single-family homes, 2 to 4 unit properties, ADU construction, manufactured and modular housing delivery, and smaller multifamily properties. And financing for these types of housing has the potential to boost supply in markets throughout the country, from supply-constrained urban markets to rural areas. The action plan includes new steps to finance and produce more manufactured housing, including Freddie Mac's announcement that it will evaluate and then begin purchasing chattel loans. The majority of people buying new manufactured housing rely on these kinds of mortgages, which typically cost more than a conventional mortgage due to higher interest rate and shorter mortgage loan terms. By creating more market liquidity for these loans, this action will reduce the cost and encourage the production of new manufactured housing for low and middle income families. Now, the action plan also includes a commitment by the Federal Housing Finance Agency and the Federal Housing Administration to work with lenders to pilot and scale the renovation and construction financing for accessory dwelling units, and to evaluate the credit performance of those loans in order to identify opportunities to improve the features of existing federal programs. As more states and jurisdictions around the country allow these kinds of units to be built, a recent independent analysis found that more than 1 million ADUs could be built in the next 5 years if the right financing tools are in place. The third group of policies really focuses on expanding and improving existing financing. Now, multiple forms of federal financing have played a critical role in boosting affordable housing supply. And that's why we've continued to advocate for more resources to those streams of funding, like the Housing Trust Fund that I know the coalition has been such a central advocate for, or home funding, for example, the low-income housing tax credit. All of these are critical existing forms of funding that are a central part of the agenda, but need support from Congress. But the administration also identified executive actions that we can take to move the supply agenda forward. So the administration announced that the Federal Housing Finance Agency will work with Fannie Mae to consider the feasibility, in addition to the safety and soundness, of purchasing construction to permanent multifamily loans. These are single closing loans that finance the construction of multifamily housing in addition to a permanent mortgage. This allows developers to only need one loan, reducing the interest rate risk, loan resizing risk, transaction costs, which can encourage production and supply. The administration is also urging more state, local, and tribal governments to dedicate more of the American Rescue Plan funds to build additional affordable housing at lower costs for families and individuals. To date, we know that jurisdictions have dedicated about $3.2 billion to production and preservation of housing. The administration is also announcing reforms to the low-income housing tax credit, including the income averaging rule that is forthcoming, and the Home Investment Partnership Program, the HOME program, which will undergo a rulemaking process too, to make it more usable in the future. We also announced some reforms to Title V, which allows for the prioritization of housing for serving people who are homeless, people experiencing homelessness, when a federal property is disposed of. And so we are undergoing a rulemaking process that will make that easier to use for the purposes of creating things like supportive housing. The fourth area is preserving the affordability of affordable single-family homes for owner occupants. The action plan also takes action to address the growing trend of large institutional investor purchases of single-family homes, which drives up home prices for lower-cost starter homes and makes it harder for aspiring first-time and first-generation home buyers, among others, to access wealth-building opportunities from home ownership. HUD in particular is acting to ensure more government-owned supply flows to owner occupants and nonprofit organizations rather than large investors, including the recently finalized guidance for an initial exclusive sales period for owner occupants, nonprofits, and government entities as part of HUD's claims without conveyance of titles process, and new efforts to encourage the use of CDBG funds for local acquisition and local sales to owner occupants and mission-driven entities. Then lastly, our last category is really focused on the other constraints, material costs and labor supply. We have an extraordinary number of homes that have been started for construction, but we're facing challenges with the completion of those homes due to some of the supply chain challenges and labor supply issues. So the action plan launches an effort across the government and the private sector to complete the most new homes in a single year by addressing these issues and improving building techniques. And that includes direct engagement with builders and others to really make sure we are spotting key issues that relate to supply chain and building materials and using other tools that we can and that will make a difference, such that like the resources in the bipartisan infrastructure law that are providing workforce development opportunities to build more of a pipeline into the construction trades. So with that, I will end and take any questions. Thank you, Diane.
Great, Erica, thanks so much. That was such a helpful overview, and congratulations and thank you for your leadership on pulling together this plan. It really is exciting to see it all in one place. So many important initiatives. We have a lot of questions coming in. I know we won't be able to answer them all, so I'll pick out a few that we can. And I'll start with the last thing you mentioned was the supply chain issues. And Caitlin Riley says that some in Congress have been calling on the White House to lift tariffs on Canadian lumber to bring down construction costs for housing. Is this something that the administration is considering? And what else can you share about how you are addressing supply chain issues and costs?
Right, thank you. So the Commerce Department did most recently, through a quasi-judicial process, which means it really has a lot of political independence, did reduce duties on Canadian lumber. So we are looking at every possible step that we can take in the larger kind of global context, trade context, but just to flag for people, that process, that quasi-judicial process did result in lowering the duties on Canadian lumber. And that was an action Commerce took.
Great, thanks. One of the pieces of the plan that I find most exciting is the willingness and the interest of the Biden administration, the commitment to using the infrastructure dollars as a carrot for local communities to do more on restrictive local zoning. So badly needed, so long overdue. It honestly felt like such a missed opportunity that Congress didn't put something like that in the infrastructure package. So it's exciting to see that even though they didn't, the Biden administration is not going to miss this opportunity. So a few questions related to that. One around what specific zoning changes can municipalities make to take advantage of the zoning reform dollars? So I think that's asking about the funds potentially in Build Back Better, but also asking which programs specifically are focused on these zoning reforms through the Department of Transportation.
Right, thank you. Thanks for that question. So on the Unlocking Possibilities program in reconciliation, the program didn't necessarily detail those specific reforms, but obviously it's very important in the local context, right? Each locality is different, kind of has some different starting places and how restrictive their zoning is and what a measurable change would look like. So the concept of the Unlocking Possibilities program and even the Housing Supply Fund and FY23 budget which is a nice complement to the Unlocking Possibilities program, is really looking at jurisdictions that are making housing forward policy changes. And I think the concept is they would present those in the context in which their current zoning exists and what improvements they've made or plan to make, and explain those contexts, and most importantly, what outcome they would get from making those changes, or what outcome have they seen from having made those changes, depending upon which program. So so I'm going to punt on the specifics about that, because the policy doesn't actually detail them, and we think local context is really important. On your other question, let me just highlight the RAISE program, which may, under the question about like which of these grant programs has incorporated this language. So RAISE is the old Tiger Grant program, which is this really flexible resource that funds a lot of different transportation type investments. It also is available at the local level and to not just states, which 60% of the transportation resources flow to the state level. This program is so sought after and highly desired because it does flow to localities. And so we think it's one of the prime examples of how we're doing this, because people want those resources so badly. And we've tied the incentive to the RAISE grant. When that one rolled out at least 2 months ago, and so I think is someplace in the application process. I do want to highlight one piece of the infrastructure bill, Diane, where Congress did make a change that maybe not everybody saw, but I think is really important, especially for your coalitions at the state and local level. I just want to bring this to your attention. So in the infrastructure law, there's new language under a component having to do with the metropolitan planning organizations, which there are over 400 metropolitan planning organizations across the country that play a role in transportation planning and the prioritization of projects for the 60% of resources that flow to states through formula funding. And for the first time, they're saying to metropolitan planning organizations, you may do a transportation and housing plan that ties more closely together how regions are thinking not just about where to put their transportation infrastructure investments, but how are they attached to and how do they take into account the housing needs in the community. So we think, the administration has to do some work to articulate what that should look like, but we think that is an opening and an opportunity that could influence that 60% of the funding that flows via formula to states.
That's great. Thanks for that, Erica. Thanks for mentioning that specifically. There's a number of people who are expressing some disappointment that the plan doesn't specifically mention programs for people who need housing and have disabilities. So maybe you could say a little bit about how some of the programs would serve that population.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. And this administration is really committed to ensuring equity for people with disabilities. And so here, what we were definitely looking at were different financing flows for the purposes of creating rental opportunities and homeownership opportunities. I think the sort of underlying opportunity through regulatory reform to ensure greater accessibility is situated with, in particular, HUD and other agencies to think about the guidance to places to ensure wider accessibility across different forms of housing. So I appreciate that feedback very much. We absolutely are committed to ensuring through our policies and encouragement of the program participants that receive that funding and are allocating funding toward housing through the combination of oftentimes tax credits and other forms of subsidy to ensure that we are increasing our supply of housing for people with disabilities.
Great, thanks, Erica. And there's, I'll ask you 3 more questions, but 2 I'm going to combine into one related to, there's a question from an anonymous attendee about whether the White House is looking into any of the new home construction methods like modular building or 3D homes. and another asking about whether the White House is considering community land trusts and their expansion in preserving affordability.
Mhm. So on the modular homes, yes, this is an area of great interest to us. I think the what I'd highlight as a first action is in the first or second week of July, HUD is holding an innovation showcase on the mall where some of these techniques will be featured. And there will be some other events surrounding that innovation showcase, but there's absolutely more we need to do to invest in and encourage more innovation in our housing construction techniques, so as to lower the cost and keep resilience and other energy efficiency, but also reduce the cost of construction. And so I would point to that action, which is just weeks away, as one step in that direction. In terms of community land trusts, I'm a huge fan. I helped to create the Chicago Community Land Trust more than 20 years ago. And in the House Passed Reconciliation package, of course, there's a Restoring Communities Community Restoration and Revitalization Fund that had resources for community land trusts. As part of that, the administration remains committed to that package. And certainly community land trusts can be a participant in and a recipient of federal funds that flow through things like CDBG and other uses. So would just highlight that.
Great, thanks. And then the last question I'll ask you for now, I will say there's been many questions coming in and we won't have a chance to get to them all. I want to be respectful of your time, but I'll say to people who are asking them to keep putting your questions in, and I'll follow up with Erica and we'll find a way to get your questions answered otherwise. But for now, Erica, if I could just ask one last question related to the home program that comes in from Richard Montgomery, and he is noting that there are some regulatory changes needed in the home program. He says he believes that the president's plan directed HUD to issue policy guidance to address some of those barriers. And he's asking if it's the intent of the administration to have HUD open the home regulations, the home rules.
Yeah, this signal we are sending in the action plan is that the administration, HUD, will engage in a rulemaking effort that will take up the kinds of reforms that can be done through executive action. Some of the reforms are statutory in nature. And so there's an assessment, going on about like which things have to be, addressed through statutory change, but where HUD has the flexibility to address things in regulation or administration, that's the signal we're sending. So the answer to that is yes.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Erica. Thanks again so much for joining, for being so generous with your time, and especially for your leadership and your work on this plan. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for the invitation. Great to be with you all. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye. All right, so we are, before we move on in the agenda, I will just reiterate that I've noted all of the questions that are coming in. We'll do our best to get them answered or to answer them in some way for all of you. There was a question, a few people have asked either in the Q&A or in the chat box to again see the link to register for the White House event that's happening tomorrow. So look at that, she's so fast. Elena just put it back in the chat box. So again, that's a reminder for everybody. There's an event that the White House is holding tomorrow. They're publishing a new plan on advancing equity through the American Rescue Plan. There's a public event for an hour. I'll be speaking at the event along with Gene Sperling and several cabinet secretaries and others. So I hope you all will join that. I also just wanted to remind everybody to read the White House plan. There's several questions asking what's in it and what's not. It's a really good read, and there's a lot there. So I encourage you to take a look at it and see it again. And just a reminder for everybody that all of these links will be sent out after the call. And yes, the call is being recorded, and we'll share the link to the recorded call as well. So we have several other really good, important topics and speakers coming up next. I am going to pass the facilitation of this call now over to Paul Keeley, who's Chief Operating Officer at NLHC. I have to jump off for something. I'll be back to listen in to our next speakers, but I'm going to ask Paul to facilitate from here. So thanks, Paul.
Sure thing, Diane. Thank you. Okay, we will move on in our agenda to the next topic. And we have several people who are going to talk to us about our work related to ending rental arrears to stop evictions or ERASE. And I believe we're going to get started with Tori Beret, who's an ERASE coordinator at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. So Tori, take it away.
Great, great. Thanks so much, Paul. I appreciate it. So hi, everyone. I'm Tori. I'm an ERASE coordinator at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. And so on May 12th, we launched the brief Extending the Reach of Emergency Rental Assistance, Leveraging Federal Resources. And so basically this brief explains how 3 federal programs, the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds, also known as SLFRF, Home Investment Partnerships, American Rescue Plan, Home ARP, and the Community Development Block Grants, Coronavirus, so CDBG-CV, can be used to bridge the gap between the U.S. Department of Treasury's ERA program and the provision of longer-term rental assistance. So this report highlights those 3 programs and how they can be utilized for emergency rental assistance and the specific details of them. It also references some states and localities that are utilizing these different sources for rental assistance. So for example, New Jersey's committed $750 million in state and local fiscal recovery funds for rental and utility assistance for households, which is really exciting. And Washington State's allocated $403 million for ERAP 2.0. So we also rank the funds in terms of most flexibility to lesser flexibility. The state and local fiscal recovery funds are a really flexible resource and can be utilized for to cover administration costs as well as some of these supportive services costs. And then the other 2 funds are a little harder to be used, but can still be utilized for emergency rental assistance purposes. And actually, California announced that ERA grantees can use the state's share of CDBG CV funds to provide rental subsidies to households to cover rent incurred on or after April 1st, 2022, which is really great. So if you want to find out more about the report and read it, I can share that link in the chat, and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Tori. And hello, everyone. Good to talk to you all today. You can go to the next slide. Great. So I'm really excited to be here to talk with everyone about our latest brief, which is called Promoting Housing Stability Through Just Cause Eviction Legislation. And as we all know, over the last year and a half, ERA really provided us with an unprecedented amount of state and local funds to invest in emergency rental assistance. But at the same time as folks have been implementing ERA, many communities have been really focusing on their attention on the different tenant protections that could be passed in conjunction or alongside emergency rental assistance to support renters. And in fact, since 2021, we've been tracking over 139 different tenant protections to support renters, prevent displacement, and promote housing stability. So it's been a really exciting time to really be looking at and working on tenant protections. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about one of those protections. We're going to talk about just cause protections. And I'm going to give a little bit of an overview, and then I'm going to introduce 3 of our guest speakers today, Allison McIntosh, Abby Ning, and Ellen Davidson, who are really going to talk about how they've implemented just cause, or how they're working on advocacy related to just cause into communities that actually are in the brief. So we can read more about them, but you'll also hear about them today. So the end of a lease term can be a really vulnerable time for low-income renters. In many states and localities around the country, while a tenant may be protected during the terms of their lease, landlords may not be required to provide a reason for evicting a tenant or not renewing a lease at the end of a lease term. So sometimes also when some landlord is unable to evict a tenant during their lease term, they may choose not to renew the tenant's lease and use that time period as a ground to not do that. So this can really place tenants at risk for unreasonable rental increases. It could provide a time for displacement, and it's a real possibility of instability for low-income renters. This is particularly true now in an economy that's impacted by high inflation rates and low housing stock. In last year, we saw average rent increases of about 14% nationwide, and some of the tighter housing markets had rent increases up to 40%. So the legal protections that are provided through just cause legislation really are intended to make that lease renewal process more predictable, to protect renters from excessive rental increases, to empower tenants to advocate for better living conditions without fear of retaliation, and to promote long-term housing stability for the lowest income and most marginalized renters. So just cause legislation, and you may have heard of it referred to as good cause legislation or for cause legislation. In the paper, we've used the term just cause just for consistency, but you'll see it referred to in different ways. But they are protections that limit the reasons for a landlord can evict a tenant or refuse to renew a lease when the tenant is not at fault or has not violated the lease in any way. And just cause laws really aim to benefit low-income tenants by protecting renters from evictions when they're at no fault of their own. They deliver a sense of stability for tenants for the longer term. They discourage renters from leaving a unit or self-evicting if they've received an eviction notice or if they've been told that the lease is not going to be renewed. And they empower tenants experiencing poor living conditions or maybe discrimination or have poor conditions in the apartment to advocate with the landlord or to file a complaint or to really work towards having better conditions within that unit. And in some cases, they can protect tenants from unreasonable rent increases. Next slide. So there's sort of what's included in just cause legislation can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so there's generally three components that are in just cause legislation. So one, it usually defines the legal grounds for eviction. Two, it places limits on rental increases. And three, oftentimes there's enhancements to the written notification process and requirements around written notification. So the foundation of all just cause legislation is really that they include provisions that define, like I said, the legal cause for which a landlord can evict a tenant or will not renew a lease. The legal definition of just cause usually involves substantial violation of a lease by a tenant, something like failure to pay rent. It could include disorderly conduct or damage or destruction to property, illegal activity. And then in some cases, it does cover situations where the landlord intends to sell the property or intends to move into the property or have a family member move into the unit or property. If the tenant receives an eviction notice without one of these just causes, the tenant can then challenge this eviction in court. In addition to the definition, like I mentioned before, the other two provisions are around limiting the power of landlords to increase rents. Oregon and California both have provisions in place around that, where they really look at what is the consumer price index inflation rate, and then looking at a standard around related to that. And then, like I said, enhancement to the written notice process, which might including ensuring that there's a documentation of the lease violation in the written notice process, or extending the time frame from which a tenant has to leave the unit. That written notice process is really important because it really helps someone know and understand the reason for the eviction. And through that process, they can collect the required documentation and prepare for their court hearings. Those provisions are very helpful within just cause legislation. And I think, as I mentioned before, these are just examples. It really does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So as you read into the brief, you'll see some of these differences teased out a little bit. Okay, next slide. So we at NLIC, we have 5 main recommendations when it comes to just cause legislation and the tenant protections in general. So the first is really states and localities should advance legislation that ideally includes all 3 of the components that I described earlier. That states and localities should also enact other tenant supportive measures and protections. And you can feel free to look at our last report around tenant protections and emergency rental assistance during and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic to get a sense of what some of the other tenant protections communities have put in place to ensure stronger protections and to limit evictions. We also recommend that once protections are in place, that state and local governments and communities develop equitable marketing strategies to ensure that tenants know about what tenant protections are available in their community and what rights they have when they're in court and with their landlord. Fourth, local courts and lawmakers should establish mechanisms to collect and analyze eviction filing and judgment data to help housing counselors, legal aid providers, policymakers all better understand the needs and serve low-income renters. This will help enforce tenant protections and then to understand the impact that different tenant protections are having on evictions. And then that will help inform further advocacy as well as implementation strategies. And then lastly, Congress should enact federal legislation creating just cause eviction standards, advancing right to counsel, and enforcing source of income discrimination bans so that there's consistency in standards nationwide that will protect renters. Next slide. So just as a reminder, this is the paper that I mentioned before that it goes into a deeper dive into the different types of tenant protections that are available. So please feel free to visit that if you have more questions or more information. So I'm happy to answer questions, but before I do that, I do want to hand it over to our guest speakers to go into depth in what's happening in both Oregon and New York State. And so I will hand it over to Allison McIntosh, who is the Deputy Director of Policy and Communication at Neighborhood Partnerships, who's really going to talk about how they are implementing just cause legislation in Oregon and some of the lessons learned from that experience that might be helpful as you think about just cause legislation within your community. So Allison, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Nice to be with you all today. Thanks for having me. My name is Allison McIntosh. I work at an organization called Neighborhood Partnerships, where I help convene a coalition called the Oregon Housing Alliance, and I use she, her pronouns. The Oregon Housing Alliance is a coalition of about 90 organizations that believe everyone deserves a safe, stable, affordable place to call home. And in 2019, we worked with partners to pass just cause and rent stabilization bill. So I'm going to share a little bit about why we did that and what the impacts have been. Prior to passing Oregon's just cause law, we knew that the situation for tenants had grown really dire in Oregon. No cause evictions can be retaliatory and discriminatory. And we also knew that no cause evictions had been impacting tenants with low incomes and BIPOC tenants and anyone who had tried to enforce their rights as a tenant for a really long time. But as Oregon began to have a more severe shortage of rental housing that was affordable to people with low and moderate incomes, no cause evictions and unlimited rent increases became a real crisis. In Oregon, also, many tenants previously were on month-to-month leases, meaning that they could be vulnerable to a no-cause eviction at any time with as little as 30 days notice. So in 2014, 2015, tenants began experiencing more significant no-cause evictions and rent spikes. We heard instances where entire buildings of people received no-cause evictions or a doubling of the rent pretty much overnight. And that led advocates to come together to fight for a just cause and rent stabilization bill in 2017 first. Unfortunately, that bill failed, which was a really heartbreaking loss, but the coalition came back together in 2019 and passed a stronger bill that provided just cause eviction plus statewide rent stabilization, which provided predictability and stability to tenants. Oregon paired the two, just cause plus rent stabilization, together because we knew that the way our housing market was functioning, renters were either getting no cause notices or extreme rent increases, and both of those allowable instances had the effect of displacing the tenant. Evictions, whether because of a rent spike or a no cause notice, are extremely destabilizing for families and individuals and also for communities. And I think one of the things that really helped our campaign succeed was to show legislators kind of the ripple effects of these laws and practices. So tenants were able to share their own personal stories of how evictions impacted them and their families. But we also heard from teachers who talked about the impact of evictions on their classroom, and nurses about the impact on patient and community health, and other stories that could really show how these widespread evictions were having really significant and negative impacts on tenants and communities. We passed our law, which was Senate Bill 608, in February of 2019, and it went into effect immediately upon signature of the governor. And that emergency provision was really important to us because we knew that some landlords would likely retaliate against their tenants and try to evict them prior to the law going into effect. And then from February of 2019, obviously until COVID came, we had about a little over a year of protection being in place before we needed to start to fight around eviction moratoriums. Senate Bill 608 has and continues to prevent evictions and rent gouging, and we're really grateful that it's been in place, particularly after the pandemic. We really needed just cause eviction for people who live in Oregon and rent their homes. There are some exceptions to the bill, so people can still receive a no-cause eviction for the first year of their tenancy, but after that, they're protected from no-cause eviction. And that has given them an increased ability to assert their rights by asking for repairs or pushing back if there's something the landlord does that's wrong. Rent gouging is also now illegal, although our rent increase limits, as you saw on the slide, is pretty high at 7% plus the consumer price index. So this year, the total allowable rent increase is 9.9%, but unfortunately, because of inflation, next year that increase will likely be over 10%. And I think advocates will start to think about whether we need to reduce that cap or not. There are some exceptions and loopholes that need to be closed, but in general, we believe that this law is providing really significant protection for tenants, providing stability and the assurance that tenants can't be evicted at any time or at the end of a lease period. I think in terms of like challenges or reflections, in Oregon, all landlord-tenant law is enforced through the court system. There is no state agency that provides oversight or assistance to tenants if there's something illegal that's happening. And this was a compromise that was necessary in order to pass the law, but we know that that has had really significant impacts on tenants. We did significantly increase the penalties for violations when landlords do something wrong as a way to try to provide an incentive for lawyers to represent tenants. We are also starting to hear that there are some places in the law where there might be a landlord-based business reason, like a landlord wants to move into the unit or move a family member in, that is allowed under the law. And there's starting to be some examples and more widespread examples of abuse of those exceptions. So we'll be closely looking at those. Obviously, based on those experiences and all of our other experiences, we would strongly encourage other folks considering these types of provisions to limit exemptions and try to make the law as simple as possible for tenants to understand and to pay attention to how tenants can enforce their rights. I will say that the Oregon Law Center and legal aid attorneys in our state were really critical to the development of the bill language to ensure that we were closing as many loopholes as possible and really thinking about how to protect tenants' rights. And I'm really excited that other states are considering this as well. So thanks everyone for having me.
Great. Thanks, Allison. That's fabulous. There's a couple questions, but because we're running a little bit behind today, I'm going to turn it right over to Abby Ning from Tenants in Neighborhood in New York, and Ellen Davidson, a staff attorney at Legal Aid in New York State, to talk about some of their pending legislation and advocacy they're doing to advance just cause legislation in New York. So Abby, I will turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm glad that NLIHC is highlighting and bringing awareness to these just cause protections. And it's great to hear what's happening in Oregon. We're in New York. We're on the final stretch of our fight this year for good cause. So it's really encouraging to hear how other states have passed it. So my name is Abby, and I work with Tenants and Neighbors in New York. Tenants and Neighbors is a grassroots nonprofit focused on preserving affordable housing and protecting tenants' rights. As part of the coordinating committee for a coalition called Housing Justice for All, we've been advocating for statewide good cause eviction. And we've been prioritizing good cause in our state because about 4 million tenants statewide, or roughly half of New York's renters, are currently unprotected from retaliatory evictions and unreasonable rent hikes. So what that means is we're seeing tenants stuck in a couple of really vulnerable positions. The first being that tenants who have asked for basic repairs or who have tried organizing their buildings have no protection against no cause holdover, and when a landlord denies them a renewal lease. And so, for example, I'm working with a tenant right now who has paid their rent on time every month, but was denied a renewal because she asked for repairs to her bathroom and her flooring and some of the common areas. And so without good cause, if she stays past her lease, she could face a pretty detrimental eviction. The second situation we're seeing is that tenants who have received reduced COVID rates, and even tenants who have been living in their apartment for several years, are now seeing these really drastic rent hikes. We've heard from like 50 to 110%. And no one can afford that. So tenants are being forced to move and basically self-evict. So it's really important that we pass good cause in New York, statewide and in localities, because good cause is a basic protection for tenants to make sure they can stay safely and stably in their homes. And it's essentially a legal defense in court if a landlord tries to evict them. And it's not as strong as rent regulation, a little bit as what you heard from Allison. But we're seeing how landlords can profit from eviction, whether they do it through official means or unofficial means like raising rent. And we know that Black and brown women are most likely to be affected by eviction. So good cause is very much a racial justice bill. Good cause protects Black and brown and working class renters from the harmful impacts of gentrification. In New York, more than half of the state's renters make less than $50,000, and that is far below the median income of homeowners in the state. Additionally, good cause protections will help people in New York recover from COVID-19. So by preventing no-fault displacement, good cause eviction will allow approximately 500,000 households behind on rent grounds to negotiate with their landlord. And get access to programs like a one-shot deal or other rental assistance. And it can also make programs like right to counsel more effective because it gives tenants an actual legal defense against an eviction. So we have been pushing back against some myths from the real estate lobby, from small landlords. And so based on a few studies, good cause does not negatively impact supply or the quality of housing. In fact, our bill is based off one in New Jersey, and New Jersey has had good cause protections for nearly 50 years. And apartment construction there has boomed in many parts of the state, and passing measures like good cause can actually increase the demand for rental housing in an area, since would-be renters could gain confidence in renting as a stable form of housing. It also gives tenants more freedom to use local code enforcement, giving them the freedom to organize and demand better living conditions in their building, which is the number one we're hearing at Tenants and Neighbors, is people really complaining about these substandard living conditions. And good cause is politically popular among voters as well. However, we've still faced challenges in passing it. So I'm going to hand it over to Ellen to talk a little bit more about that.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
Oh, great. I can't turn my video on, so I apologize. Hi, I'm Ellen Davidson. I'm a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society, which is located in New York City. And we also work with the Housing Justice for All Coalition. And we are in the last, our legislative session ends next week, and we are in the last throes of a very active campaign to try to get good cause eviction passed on the state level. Things for folks who are considering these type of campaigns to think about. We've been trying to get a good cause eviction law passed since 2019. It has been challenging. There's a sense that renter issues are only New York City issues and not part of the rest of our state. Although most of the data shows that not to be the case. One thing that has helped move our campaign forward is local jurisdictions started passing good cause. So that was helpful both in terms of getting more and more tenants to understand why good cause eviction laws would be helpful for them, and to have elected officials recognize problems in their own communities. But in New York, as in I think a lot of other states, there are problems with what localities can and cannot do on eviction laws such as this one. And all of the laws that were passed are currently in court being challenged on preemption grounds. The threat of lawsuit has certainly stopped some campaigns in some cities from moving forward because cash poor cities fear having to pay for lawsuits. The other thing that I think has been challenging and that people should think about are, the real estate industry has spent tremendous amounts of money to stop what, to our mind, is a pretty common sense, light form of regulation. And they've made small property owners who own small buildings, the face of their campaign. And so all the conversation is, what can we do to help small landlords? And unfortunately, a lot of elected officials have relatives and friends who are small property owners. They're more likely to have them as their friends and relatives, frankly, than they are to have tenants as friends and relatives. And so their entire focus is on protecting people they know. And then lastly, and this was something we've come across and really struggle to understand how to face this challenge, is that a lot of elected officials, especially BIPOC elected officials, say they don't support good cause because they see good cause as harming Black and Brown and Asian constituents who have started out building generational wealth by becoming landlords. And they say, once our people got their foot on the property ladder, now you're trying to limit the amount of value they can extract from their investments. And so, there's a real avoidance of understanding that the people who live in these buildings are also tenants of color, but there's a real, we've been really challenged because we see stability in housing as being a racial justice issue, but the landlords are also using some of the same language to push back against good cause. I know we're running out of time, so I will end there. But thank you so much for having us to talk about this.
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing that detailed information from the NLIC staff to our special guest speakers. Really outstanding information, extremely valuable. We are very, very tight on time. I've been offered by one of our panelists that Andrea Olson has volunteered to go on our next call. So we're going to accept her offer, and I'm really appreciative of you making that offer, Andrea. We'll now turn very quickly to, I think it's now Angela Stovall from Just Fix NYC is going to be presenting briefly. And I think Johanna is not able to join us, so I think that Angela Stovall is now going to present instead. Is that correct?
Yes. Joe
Okay.
can't make it with us, but
Okay,
I'm
great.
going to try to fill in her spot, and I'll try to go as quickly as possible. So my name is Angela Stovall. I'm the Research and Policy Manager at Just Fix. Just Fix is a nonprofit that co-creates tools with tenants, organizers, and legal advocates to fight displacement and achieve stable, healthy housing for all, leveraging the power of data and technology to support individual and collective action for housing justice. So we believe that everyone deserves a dignified tenancy with access to legal representation, social services, and opportunities to organize while navigating the complex and currently inequitable world of housing. So we have a bunch of different products and tools that have been co-created with different community groups on the ground, but I'm going to speak with you pretty briefly about our tool, Who Owns What? So Who Owns What is basically a one-stop shop for unveiling property ownership. So what we do is take public source data and aggregate it into one location. So it provides a snapshot of current housing conditions and recent history around a given building and associated portfolio. So as many of you know, navigating New York City housing of who actually owns a building is very purposely difficult to understand. It's very opaque. They are hidden behind various LLCs and business entities to insulate themselves from liability. So what Who Owns What does is kind of break down that veil and gives you like the actual individuals that own the building and create these connections to show what is the general information of a landlord and their holding. So you get a good sense of who they are and what other buildings throughout the city they own. So you get a good understanding of like their portfolio generally. It also provides crucial information about code violations, evictions, rent stabilization status as reported by the owner of the buildings, and their just general property ownership. It also links to data from other city agencies. So it can be a really helpful tool for researching in the housing that you live in currently. You can use it in your own housing search to get, a better understanding of the general information of your landlord and their holdings or potential building that you may move into. And it's also a really great tool for organizers and advocates to like map out how much control does this owner really have within the, the depth of their portfolio within the real estate market, and also a great way of connecting different tenants and tenant groups together, especially when they have seemingly different issues, or maybe they have the same issues, and you can kind of like, harness collective tenant power together using that tool. One of the great things that you also you can use for Who Owns What is you can get up-to-date information on housing code violations, evictions, rent stabilization status. It links to other data from city agencies like HPD, DOB, ACRIS, Department of Finance, and other housing data projects. It displays the landlord portfolios and it identifies certain behaviors over time, like violations, evictions, destabilizations, and allows for easy exports of that data as well. One of the great things too that has been a new change in the Who Owns What methodology is that before you could only search by an address. So you could put in any address in the city and click search, and you would see all of the other associated buildings and with that address. But now you can actually search by landlord name, which is a really helpful tool in accessing like a more in-depth understanding of a landlord's portfolio and how many buildings they have within their holdings. So you can look at, when you do that, you can either search by, like I said, address or landlord name, and you can find the block, borough, and lot number, the number of units at this particular building, all of the open violations, total violations, including open and closed violation report to the city by HPD, eviction is executed since 2017 in the building, and any change in rent stabilization status. And one of the other compelling features of Who Owns What is it also lists the most common 311 complaint, even if it hasn't been issued as a violation by HPD, which is also really helpful because, as many of you know, once HPD actually comes out to assess certain hazards, not all issues get captured. So like if it's an issue with heat, for example, they may come on a day where it isn't quite as cold, or if it's an issue with an infestation, it may appear abated, even though it's really not the case. So that's really helpful as well. One of the other new visualizations under the landlord portfolio tab is a new graphic that shows all the related business entities. So all the related properties and interconnected personnel between two distinct portfolios. So you might see search a particular landlord like Wavecrest Management and see that it has, now over 1,000 buildings because there's related personnel with Shinda Management, and then you can organize around that particular area. And identify new targets and bad actors as a part of collective actions, campaigns, and larger organizing efforts with your tenants and neighbors. And you can also switch back to the old version if you're more comfortable with that. But I can put the link to the website in the chat. And I can also provide my email or something like that. So if you have any other follow-up questions, I know we're tight on time, so I'll leave it at that for now. But I'll put the link in the chat.
Fantastic, Angela. I will just say there were lots of comments in the Q&A box and in the chat saying, what a great tool, and a bunch saying, how do we get this in my state? Somebody was saying, where's the clapping emoji? I'm going to clap for this tool. Fantastic.
Oh, that's great. There are tools like this popping up all over the country that are kind of using this model. And there's a landlord mapping collective that we're a part of that is helping other cities kind of launch these types of tools. So if your city doesn't have it now, it's possible they're working on it.
Fantastic. Great job. Thank you for sharing that tool. And I want to thank Andrea Olson for being such a great team player and volunteering to go next time. We have gone over time. I want to thank all of our panelists, everybody who participated on today's call. Just a reminder, we will be sending out a follow-up email with a recording of this call, the PowerPoints that were used during this call. We want to encourage you to please sign your organizations on to the 302B letter that we talked about earlier for the FY23 appropriation, and also to sign your organization on to the supporting the Eviction Crisis Act. So those are a couple of actions to take right away. Obviously, contact your members of Congress by email and phone about the FY23 appropriations, and then later when it's time on the reconciliation bill. But thank you everybody for participating on today's call. We will look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks for our next call, and have a great week, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.